The cold stone pressed against Jake's back as he groaned, blinking himself awake in the dim, flickering light. His head pounded, and he reached out blindly, feeling rough walls on either side. He tried to remember how he got here but couldn't recall anything beyond his camping trip in the mountains. Yet he was nowhere near his tent. Slowly, Jake pushed himself up, his fingers grazing the strange, damp walls of his surroundings. The air smelled musty, laced with something foul and metallic. His eyes adjusted to the faint, flickering light coming from a torch bracketed into the wall nearby. He squinted at it, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Stone walls, a narrow corridor stretching into darkness, and something about the place that made his skin crawl. "Where am I?" he murmured to himself, feeling an instinctive unease. He took a tentative step forward, trying to keep his breathing steady. That's when he heard it, a distant, scuttling sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up. "Okay, Jake. Keep calm," he muttered, swallowing hard. He mentally ran through his options, which were grimly limited. No supplies, no clear sense of direction, and from the sound of it, something definitely moving in the shadows. Jake's instincts told him to arm himself. He looked around the corridor for anything he could use. His fingers closed around a loose stone, heavy but manageable. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Holding it like a makeshift weapon, he took a few cautious steps forward, moving in the direction opposite the noise. The corridor stretched longer than he expected, twisting and turning in ways that felt unnatural. Symbols lined the walls, strange and otherworldly, symbols he couldn't recognize. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but the worst part was a kind of malevolent intelligence behind that gaze. As Jake rounded a corner, he caught sight of something slithering in his periphery, a glistening, gelatinous creature slowly inching along the floor. It looked like a blob of translucent jelly, pulsing with a faint greenish glow. He froze, eyes widening. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, but he steadied himself, gripping the rock tighter. He had no idea what this thing was, but if he had any hope of surviving, he needed to understand his enemies. Taking a step back, he accidentally scuffed the floor, and the creature turned toward him, its jelly-like body undulating with unnatural speed. Panic flooded him, but Jake forced himself to act. As the blob moved closer, he raised the stone and swung, smashing it down with all his strength. The creature quivered under the blow, splattering as Jake struck again and again until it finally stopped moving, its form dissolving into a slimy puddle. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps as he wiped the slime from his hand onto his pants. This was no ordinary place, he realized. His mind tried to make sense of what he'd seen, but nothing in his experience prepared him for creatures like this. Whatever was going on, he knew it wasn't some hallucination. As he looked down at the dissolved creature, something dawned on him. Whoever, or whatever, had put him here wasn't expecting him to make it out alive. Unbeknownst to Jake, something else was observing his every move. In the hidden core of the dungeon, a sentient force watched him with curiosity and disdain. This human was not like the others who had occasionally stumbled in, or so it thought. Those other intruders, goblins, kobolds, even elves, were easy prey, succumbing swiftly to the dungeon's traps and creatures. But this human had defied the initial traps, as clumsy as his tactics were. The dungeon core, a silent entity with vast control over the dungeon, adjusted its plans. If this human would not crumble under fear or simple monsters, it would test him further. Meanwhile, Jake pressed on, wary of every shadow. His throat was dry, and the lack of any supplies gnawed at his nerves, but the sight of another hallway branching out spurred him forward. At the intersection, he found what looked like the broken remnants of some kind of wooden spear, splintered at the end. He picked it up, relieved to have something longer than a rock to defend himself. "All right," he whispered, gripping the weapon tightly. "Bring it on." In the recesses of the dungeon core, an awareness pulsed with both irritation and excitement. It hadn't encountered a creature as stubborn as this human in ages. It adjusted itself again, calculating a new path for him, a series of traps, puzzles, and creatures more deadly than any Jake had seen yet. But Jake, unaware of the mind he was up against, felt only a surge of determination. He'd survive this whatever it took. There was something within him, a stubborn drive, and he felt it flare to life with each step forward. And as the dungeon watched, it too began to wonder for the first time what a human might be truly capable of. Chapter 1 sets up Jake's disorientation, the dungeon's hostility, and the core's curiosity. He's outmatched, but the core's interest is piqued by his resilience, and Jake's determination to survive is clear. The dungeon core pulsed with irritation. It had spent eons honing its defenses, crafting elaborate traps, and deploying ruthless creatures to eradicate intruders. But this human was proving unexpectedly difficult. Jake had survived his initial encounters and moved steadily through each corridor, his resolve apparently unbreakable. As Jake navigated deeper, the core monitored him, analyzing his patterns. Unlike the goblins and kobolds who typically stumbled into its domain, this human was crafty, improvising weapons from broken wood and stone and using them with surprising effectiveness. The dungeon's traps, designed to exploit fear and recklessness, barely fazed him. Where other intruders would hesitate, Jake moved with purpose, adapting with each step. He wasn't driven by blind bravery, the core noted, but by something else: survival. Jake paused at an intersection, feeling the weight of the dungeon's presence all around him. He could almost sense the intelligence behind it, something watching, assessing him like a predator sizing up prey. He'd encountered a set of symbols carved into the stone, their meaning unknown, but they unsettled him. Still, he brushed it off and pressed forward. He couldn't afford to let anything shake him, not here. The core, puzzled, adjusted its strategy. If this human resisted fear, it would escalate the threat level. Shifting its focus, the core summoned something far deadlier than the low-level creatures it had deployed before. A skeletal warrior clad in rusted armor, armed with a chipped but menacing sword. Its orders were simple: end the human. Jake heard the telltale clanking of armor echoing down the corridor. Gripping his makeshift spear, he felt a jolt of anxiety, but he steadied his breathing. Whatever was coming, he knew he'd have to face it head-on. The narrow corridor offered little room for retreat. The skeletal warrior emerged from the shadows, its empty eye sockets glowing faintly. Jake swallowed hard but held his ground, every instinct in him screaming to run. But he had no choice, he'd survive or die here. The warrior lunged, swinging its sword with surprising speed. Jake dodged, barely avoiding the rusty blade, and jabbed his spear forward. The sharp, splintered edge scraped against bone but didn't stop the creature. It advanced relentlessly, unfeeling, mechanical. Jake could feel himself tiring, and he knew he had to think quickly. Looking around, he spotted a crumbling section of the ceiling above. Dodging another strike, he lured the skeletal warrior toward it and, with a desperate shove, thrust the spear up into the weakened stone. The rocks came crashing down, burying the skeletal warrior under the debris. Jake exhaled, heart pounding as he looked at the rubble, relief flooding him. He was alive, and once again he had outsmarted the dungeon. The core watched, astonished. This human wasn't like the others. Where most would have surrendered or panicked, Jake had adapted, even strategized. For the first time in centuries, the core felt a stirring of something unfamiliar, a strange blend of frustration and reluctant admiration. Jake's steps echoed as he moved deeper into the labyrinthine dungeon, now more cautious than ever. The defeat of the skeletal warrior had left him exhausted but emboldened. He knew he wasn't alone down here, and he wasn't referring to the mindless creatures. There was something controlling this place, something actively pushing him toward his limits. Turning a corner, Jake froze at the sight of a small, scaly creature trapped inside a heavy iron cage. It had sharp, intelligent eyes, and though it was covered in scales like a lizard, it was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It looked up as he approached, and its eyes widened in surprise, as if it had never expected to see a human. "Help me," it whispered, its voice raspy but unmistakably intelligent. Jake hesitated, instinctively wary. But something in the creature's desperate gaze stirred his empathy. He examined the cage. The lock was simple, nothing a determined yank couldn't break, so he gripped the bars and pulled hard. With a creak, the lock gave way and the door swung open. The creature stretched its wings, a small dragon, Jake realized in awe. It was weak, its scales dull and its frame gaunt. "Thank you," it said, bowing its head. "I am Tarek. They captured me to guard their treasures, but I refused. So they imprisoned me instead." Jake nodded. "Well, looks like you're free now. But I don't suppose you know a way out of here?" Tarek narrowed his eyes, a glimmer of cunning lighting up his gaze. "Perhaps if you protect me from what's coming?" As if summoned, the walls shifted, revealing a series of traps designed to funnel intruders directly into a pit. Tarek hissed and took a step back, clearly unnerved, but Jake moved forward, analyzing the scene. A pattern emerged in the moving tiles. He had a rough idea of how to dodge them and motioned for Tarek to follow him. Working together, they navigated through the deadly corridor. Jake would leap forward first, using his agility to trigger traps while Tarek scurried safely behind him. Despite Tarek's weakened state, his keen eyesight warned Jake of hidden dangers, like pressure plates disguised as loose stones and deadly pendulums waiting in the shadows. Finally, they emerged into a larger chamber. Jake exhaled in relief, but Tarek shot him a wary look. "You're different from others I've seen here," Tarek said, studying him with a strange intensity. "Most creatures break but you fight." "I don't have much of a choice," Jake replied. "I have to survive no matter what." The dungeon core watched with renewed fascination. The human had not only evaded its latest traps but was now forging alliances. That was something unheard of. Yet here he was, using both wits and kindness to forge a path forward. For the first time, the dungeon's strategy faltered. This human was more than a challenge, he was rewriting the rules of the dungeon itself. Jake and Tarek moved through the dungeon's winding corridors, their uneasy alliance strengthening with each step. The little dragon's knowledge of the dungeon and Jake's persistence had made them a formidable team. Together, they overcame traps and fought off creatures, each encounter a testament to Jake's resolve and Tarek's resourcefulness. Finally, they reached the heart of the dungeon, a vast chamber with walls lined in pulsing, eerie light. In its center, set into the floor like a gemstone, was the dungeon's core. It throbbed with dark energy, casting a sickly glow over the room. Jake could feel its sentient gaze locking onto him, radiating a mix of anger and curiosity. He knew this was the entity that had orchestrated every obstacle, testing him, pushing him to his breaking point. Tarek shivered beside him, instinctively shrinking back. "The core is powerful. It may not let you leave alive," he whispered. Jake tightened his grip on his makeshift spear. "Then it'll have to work harder to stop me." The core, sensing his defiance, emitted a deep, reverberating hum, and tendrils of dark energy began snaking from its surface, coalescing into the form of a massive, armored figure. The creature loomed over Jake, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence, and raised an ethereal blade. Jake's heart pounded, but he planted his feet firmly, refusing to back down. The creature lunged, swinging its blade in a deadly arc. Jake dodged, rolling across the ground and narrowly avoiding the strike. He countered with a quick jab of his spear, but it merely glanced off the creature's armor. "Tarek?" Jake called, struggling to hold his ground. "Any ideas?" The little dragon's eyes gleamed as he scanned the core's structure. "The core's focus is split between this guardian and maintaining its form. If you can distract it, I can disrupt its energy flow." Jake nodded, realizing they had only one chance. He charged the armored guardian, feinting with his spear to keep it occupied. Every move took every ounce of his strength and focus, but he pushed through, ducking, dodging, and rolling to stay just one step ahead. Meanwhile, Tarek slinked around to the core itself, pressing his claws into the glowing surface. With a powerful hiss, he forced his own energy into it, disrupting the core's control over the guardian. The armored figure wavered, its form flickering as if struggling to hold together. Seizing the opportunity, Jake drove his spear into a chink in its armor. The guardian let out a shuddering moan, dissolving into shadows that faded into the air. The core pulsed erratically, its light dimming. Panting, Jake turned to face the core, his gaze steely. "This ends now," he said. "Let us go." For a moment, the core was silent, its energy unstable. Then, as if acknowledging defeat, it pulsed one final time. A hidden door creaked open at the far end of the chamber. Jake and Tarek exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of relief and triumph. They had done the impossible. They'd beaten the dungeon not just through force but through determination, intelligence, and an unexpected alliance. As they stepped through the door and into the light beyond, the core hummed thoughtfully, forever changed by the human who had defied it.